Let me get an idea of who we've got here. Where are you guys in life? You're all freshmen. Sophomore. Senior. Uh-oh, what's next? MBA. Nice. All right. Gap year? And then med school. Okay. I like the gap year. You got to live life a little bit, y'all. It's okay to take a gap year. Don't take like a gap 10 years. It gets weird after that. Okay? Cool. All right. Well, I think you're here to learn about tourniquets, right? Have you guys done a stop the bleed or anything like that before? Okay, raise your hand if you've done stop the bleed, because y'all are gonna, best believe you're gonna come up here and demonstrate. We have a lot of people, so we're gonna have to break up into groups and you guys are gonna have to teach them. Okay, so we're gonna do things a little bit different than stop the bleed, because stop the bleed isn't paying me to be here today. So we're actually gonna do a little bit of a teaching session, and then we're gonna do stop the bleed. Because the whole point of stop the bleed is managing the pathophysiology of what happens when you are bleeding. Yeah? You guys were like, I didn't plan to come to school today. It's cool. We're gonna see if I can do this on this Zoom board. It's gonna be real, not very pretty, but we're gonna make it happen. Okay, so raise your hand if you know what the whole point of putting a tourniquet on somebody is. Tell me. Okay, to stop heavy bleeding, which is a good point to make, because you get a paper cut, you're not putting a tourniquet on. I mean, actually, if you get a cut on your finger, I do put this fancy little thing called a tourniquet on in the ER, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about stopping major bleeding. But why? Because the two most important questions in medicine are always how and why. Because you can memorize every fact there is to know in all of medicine. You can memorize my entire book. It's called Tintinalli's Emergency Medicine. But if you don't know why all those facts matter, and you don't know how to actually employ them and deliver them to your patient, it doesn't matter, right? You could spew a bunch of lovely medical knowledge, but if you can't actually provide care to your patient, it doesn't matter. So why are we trying to stop the bleeding with our tourniquet? What do you guys think? Don't be shy. There's no wrong answers. The best way to learn is to be wrong. Okay, to prevent major blood loss. But why? Why do we care about major blood loss? Give me your arm. Oh, man. Why do we care about major blood loss? Anybody? What you got? Okay, your body's going to stop functioning without, that's not tight enough, y'all. It's not, but we don't want to hurt him. Your body's going to stop functioning if you don't have adequate blood supply. But why?
Because your blood helps transport oxygen.
Okay, because your blood helps transport oxygen, but why does that matter? You're like, oh my God, stop. Okay, we're going to get there. We're gonna do this as a little exercise to kind of show you why that matters. So the first thing that happens when you have a traumatic injury, I'll take this down. We're gonna see we should have made bets on how long he could last. After you have a traumatic injury and you're bleeding in a significant way, something starts to happen. But the first thing that sets off this sort of downstream effect in this process of hemorrhagic shock is the blood loss itself. But what happens when you lose blood? What do you guys think? Seniors, it's on you. Seniors that have done human physiology. What happens? Okay, your body goes into shock and you pass out, but why? What does that mean? What does the shock mean? And why do you pass out? Don't overthink it, y'all. You're overthinking it.
The blood isn't going to your brain.
Okay, your blood's not going to your brain. Why?
I think because of the reduced blood pressure.
Because your blood pressure goes down. Good job. It's all tied together. So first you get a decreased volume in your body of blood. There's less blood inside your vessels, there's less blood inside your heart, and that does something. It makes your blood pressure go down. It's gonna be a struggle, y'all. So your blood pressure goes down, but why? Oh, that's not working. Why does your blood pressure go down? Does anybody know? Anybody? Anybody? It's not a trick question. Okay. It's a volume problem itself, is what he's saying. Who's done physics? Who loved physics? Yeah. You loved physics?
Is it like force per unit area?
Yeah, it's force and area and things about fluid flow and volume, etc. So what happens in your heart is that your heart requires a specific amount of volume inside of it to stretch the muscle to make it squeeze effectively. If your muscle doesn't get stretched by adequate blood filling up the heart, it can't really squeeze very effectively. The muscle has to get stretched in order to be able to squeeze against that force inside of it in order to push blood forward. So if there's less volume inside the heart, it gets these kind of wimpy little squeezes. And what happens is that you get decreased cardiac output. And the cardiac output is basically the amount of blood that's moving forward over time. Amount of blood that's moving forward over time. So your blood pressure decreases, and then what happens? Your heart rate increases. Why? Your body's working harder. Why? Say that again?
To get the blood everywhere, it needs to work hard.
Right, to get the blood everywhere, because we're still trying to move blood forward. But if we're squeezing less hard, that means we're moving less blood forward, right? So if we're moving less blood forward, we need to move that smaller amount more times to get the same end result. Does that make sense? Like if I'm carrying boxes and I have a big pallet full of boxes and I can stack them all up and move them all once over time to the other side of the room, that's more efficient than if I took them one by one. If I take them one by one, I have to move them faster over time to get them there in the same amount of time and the same volume. So we have an increased heart rate because we're trying to compensate for that decreased volume moving forward. But why? Someone said it earlier. What's the whole point of the blood moving forward? To deliver oxygen. To deliver oxygen to your body. And we call that perfusion, which is the delivery of the blood to the end organs, to your cells, all of the nutrients, but especially oxygen. But why do we care? Why do we care about oxygen?
Like aerobic respiration.
Because we need aerobic respiration. Why? To make energy. Why?
To power our system.
To power your entire body. I told you there was no trick questions, right? So the whole point is that in order to live, you have to have energy for your cells to function. And you can't make adequate energy without oxygen. Can you make energy without oxygen? You can. What's that called? Anaerobic respiration, but it's not very efficient. So let's back up a little bit. What happens when you bleed blood? You lose volume and you lose a few other things. What else do you lose? Not a trick question.
Nutrients.
You lose nutrients. Where do the nutrients live inside your blood? Okay, some of them live in your cells, but before they get to your cells, they're floating around in something. Plasma. Good job. They're floating around in your plasma. What the heck is plasma? Not plasma. What is plasma? Don't overthink it. They're like, it's the stuff where the nutrients are floating around. Duh. Yes, you're right. You're right. So plasma is what's left over when we suck out all of your blood cells out of your blood. So if you didn't know this, you could go donate your plasma and get paid like, it used to be like $200 or something. I don't know how much it is anymore. But what you do is you go to this plasma donation center and they suck out your blood and they put it in a centrifuge, which spins it really fast, and all the cells, because they're heavier, they sink to the bottom. And what's left at the top is mostly water and all of the stuff that's not very heavy. So your plasma is basically water and all of the stuff that is not the cells. Okay, we're going to come back to that. What else do you lose when you bleed blood? What else is in blood? Sugar, that's part of your nutrients. That's going to be floating in your plasma. Your cells, so partly white blood cells. I'm not going to put white blood cells up there because in trauma we don't actually care about them. Sorry, white blood cells. What else do we lose? Platelets. What else? Water, that's in your plasma. Red blood cells. Okay, I like it. And there's one other thing, but we'll come back to that. Let's stick with the red blood cells for a second. Why do we care about the red blood cells? Don't overthink it. What's the point of red blood cells? They're the ones that carry the oxygen. So when we lose red blood cells out onto the ground, you got your arm chopped off down on 6th Street. We won't ask what you were doing. It was fine. It was fine. When you get an injury and you bleed blood, you're bleeding that out onto the ground. And when you bleed your red blood cells out onto the ground, you lose your oxygen carrying capacity. And that oxygen carrying capacity is the big part of this perfusion. So what you're ultimately losing is perfusion. So we have decreased perfusion, which is problematic because why? We already said it. If we have decreased perfusion, that means we have decreased oxygen to our cells, which means we have decreased aerobic metabolism. Don't judge me. I can't think and type at the same time. Better than thinking and writing. So we get decreased aerobic metabolism, which means we have decreased energy, right? But your body still has to live. And you don't just die immediately, right? You don't die immediately if you hold your breath for a super long time. You don't die immediately if you're in septic shock. So what happens? We already said it, right? Anaerobic metabolism. What's the point of anaerobic metabolism? For why? She said fermentation. What's the point? We don't have oxygen, but we still have to accomplish the same goal. And the same goal is what? Make energy. What's the problem with anaerobic metabolism with respect to making energy? It's not very efficient. So you're getting less ATP than you would get if you were doing aerobic metabolism, right? And at some point, someone made you memorize that and do it on a test, didn't they? It actually mattered, but the number didn't. You could have just memorized that fact and you would have been fine. Sorry. So you make less ATP for the effort you're putting in. What's the other downside of anaerobic metabolism? It makes a bunch of byproducts. And in particular, what are the byproducts that are bad? Lactic acid. I love it. All right. So what we get is less ATP and we get lactic acid buildup as a byproduct. You're like, okay, why are we even talking about this? This is why I'm talking about it. Because in trauma, we have a thing that we used to call the lethal triad. Has anybody heard of the lethal triad before? Our Army folks have. The lethal triad is a triangle that we have put labels on and we've told you will at some point in your career memorize as the important things that go into trauma. And the question I ask people that are like, yes, I've heard of the lethal triad is, why do we pick a bunch of words out of a giant textbook about trauma and put them on a triangle and tell you to memorize them? Well, this is why. because the lethal triad is actually representing the bad sequence of pathophysiology that happens when you bleed too much blood. Now, a couple of years ago, we changed this lethal triad to what we call the deadly diamond, or the risky rhombus, or the perilous parallelogram. I didn't make up any of these words. And on the deadly diamond is 4 things. One of them is acidosis. That's very, very bad when it comes to trauma, when it comes to hemorrhagic shock, acidosis. Does anybody know any of the other ones? Army people. Okay, coagulopathy. Can someone tell me what coagulopathy is? It's a problem with your blood clotting. It's an inability to clot blood. Or really in general, coagulopathy could be too much blood clotting or too little blood clotting. In this case, we're talking about too little blood clotting. The other things that are on there are hypocalcemia. Now that's something that we just added a couple of years ago. It wasn't a new discovery. We just started to realize based on all of the science and the data that we got out of the wars in Afghanistan that hypocalcemia was much more problematic than we used to think it was. And the last thing is hypothermia. So we're talking about how we get all of this stuff related to blood loss and hemorrhagic shock because it explains why we picked those things out and put them on a shape and tell you to memorize them. And this lactic acidosis is responsible for what? That did not need to be that aggressive. That's the acid. That's the acidosis. So let's keep going with all of these. And let's go back to this plasma that you guys were talking about. You said that in plasma is water, nutrients, but there's some other stuff that's in water, in the plasma. You guys think of anything else that's floating around in your plasma? Hormones, yep, love that. What else? Salt, love that. So salt we keep in a category called electrolytes. And what do you guys, does anybody know what the electrolytes are that we care about? So potassium, salt, what else? Sodium, yep. That's the Na, sodium. Calcium, oh my gosh, calcium, didn't we just talk about calcium? Calcium, what else is in there? Magnesium, phosphorus, some other ones. Good job, that's good enough. Okay, what else is in plasma? Stem cells are probably, maybe, I don't know enough about stem cells. Maybe, probably, I don't know. Yeah, oh yeah, you're right. Stem cells somewhere in there. What else? One big thing that we're thinking about, it actually is, what's that? Close. What are enzymes made of? Proteins. So there's lots and lots of proteins in your plasma that are floating around. Albumin is one that you'll hear about a lot. We don't actually really care about it right now, but there are some proteins that we very much care about in your plasma, and those are your coagulation factors. Why do you think we care about your coagulation factors? Because if we lose coagulation factors, we lose our ability to clot. So when we're bleeding red blood cells out onto the ground. We're losing our oxygen carrying capacity. When we bleed our plasma out onto the ground, we're losing our coagulation factors, which means we're losing our ability to clot blood. So this is where we get our coagulopathy. Good. So that's problematic, right? We already said it's problematic because we put it on a diamond and told you to memorize it. So the problem there is that we're losing our ability to clot. What do you think about these platelets? Why do we care about these platelets? Who's memorized the coagulation cascade? Oh, you will. It will be terrible. They'll also, it's like the Krebs cycle. They're going to make you memorize these 1 zillion pathway coagulation cascade to put it on a test to never remember it again. Okay. Good. So what's happening is that when your body says, I need to make a blood clot, some things get turned on. And the first thing that gets turned on are your platelets. And your platelets get sticky and they stick to the hole in your blood vessel or whatever it is. And that starts the process of the clotting cascade. And the clotting cascade is called a cascade because one thing starts and it triggers the next thing, which triggers the next thing, which triggers the next thing. And there are a whole bunch of different clotting factors that are involved in this process that are normally not turned on in your system. Because if they were turned on all the time, that means you would be clotting all the time. And that would be probably not a good thing, right? So some people who have clotting disorders have too much of that clotting happening when it shouldn't be, and that's a bad thing. So your body doesn't turn that on until it needs to, and it starts by turning on your platelets. So your platelets are also part of your clotting cascade. And if your clotting cascade is messed up, the same thing happens, that you get this coagulopathy. Now, the next question is, well, how do they get turned on? And this is important because the way your clotting cascade gets turned on is also a big problem in trauma and a big reason that people die when their bleeding is uncontrolled. Because when you have a massive trauma and you've lost a lot of blood, your body doesn't clot very well. The one time it desperately needs to clot, it just can't do it. And the reason it can't do it is in part because you've lost this calcium. So calcium, this guy right here, actually is part of the clotting cascade. It activates some of your clotting factors and it also activates your platelets. So when you don't have enough calcium because you've bled your plasma out onto the ground and therefore bled your calcium out onto the ground, you can't turn on your clotting cascade when you desperately, desperately need to. That's a problem, right? Because if you can't form a clot, what's going to happen? You're going to keep bleeding and you're going to die. Now, the last thing is a little bit trickier that we lose when we're bleeding, and that is heat. Does anybody, who are our physics people? I feel you. There are like 3 things that I ever needed to know from physics. This is literally one of the 3. And this is the only reason I needed to know it. We could have covered physics in literally a week and been done with it. We could have covered OChem in 0 days and we'd be fine, just so you know. So physics, when we're talking about heat, where does heat stored when we're thinking in a physics standpoint? Yep. This is sort of a crappy question. Where does heat stored in your body? It's a crappy question. It's stored in liquid. So liquid holds heat. Do you guys remember that vaguely from physics? Yeah, me neither. I didn't remember that from physics. I only know that because then I had to relearn it to be a doctor. And then I'm like, oh, that's why I took physics 10 years ago and don't remember any of it. So liquid holds heat. So I won't ask you who's done this because I don't want to, tell everybody all your secrets, but one of you at least has peed in the snow before. When that one person in the world has peed in the snow, what happens to the snow? It melts and it turns yellow. But why does it melt? Because your pee is hot. Why is your pee hot? Because liquid holds heat. So when you bleed blood out onto the ground, you're just losing heat out onto the ground. Now, it's far more complex than that, as you would imagine. But the first part is you're just bleeding heat out onto the ground. Now, just bleeding disrupts a lot of your body's ability to regulate your heat. But at the very, very basic level, you're just bleeding heat onto the ground. And when you bleed heat onto the ground, you lose heat. What happens? Not a trick question. You get cold. And what happens when you get cold? You don't get hypothermic yet, but somewhere down here, you get hypothermic. There's a few steps in between. We're not going to name them yet because we're actually going to go back over to this acidosis thing. Because we just talked about a whole bunch of stuff and we found our 4 points of our deadly diamond are coagulopathy, are, let me put it over here, hypocalcemia, and our heat loss. But we didn't really talk about why those matter. We just talked about how we got there. So now we got to talk about why they matter. Let's go back to the acidosis, and I'm going to type a word on the board here, and I'm going to trigger everyone. I'm sorry. I see, you learn these things for a reason. What is this? Say it like you got an A in the class. Homeostasis. What is homeostasis? Regulation of everything, balance inside your body, equilibrium. Anybody else? These are all great words. Maintenance of a standard or maybe a set of parameters in your body. What's the point of homeostasis? Why did they make you learn about it in human physiology, or will make you learn about it when you take that?
Everything wants to return to homeostasis.
Everything wants to be in this homeostatic state. Why? Why? It's stable. But why do we care whether it's stable or not? In order for the body to function properly, we need to be within certain parameters. Yeah? Why? Gah!
You know, like certain, like you say, enzymes that only function under specific conditions, like temperature or like acidity or whatever.
Yes. So your enzymes, which are made up of proteins, only function within certain parameters. Now, there's a whole bunch that goes into homeostasis, but at the very fundamental granular level, we're talking about very specific parameters that we need in order for our proteins to function properly. And two of the most important ones are, you said it, don't overthink it, temperature and pH. Holy smokes. Why? No, we're not going to go that way. So your enzymes don't function outside of specific temperature ranges. Everyone agree? And your proteins don't function outside of specific pH ranges. Everyone agree? That's why we need homeostasis, because if they don't work, nothing works, because basically everything's made of proteins, right? Your cells are made of proteins, your enzymes are made of proteins. And if everything is out of homeostasis, nothing's going to work. What does that tell you about what's on this board? What do you guys think? What color this is going to be? Gray. That's dumb. I don't know how to change it. So that acidosis is problematic because why? Because nothing's going to work when you're acidotic, or at least it's going to work less good, and then it's going to keep getting less good until it stops functioning entirely. Okay, same with the hypothermia. If you're too cold, your stuff doesn't work very well. Well, let's go back up to this first line that we talked about, and let's talk a little bit more about this. Somewhere on here is a heart. It's an increased heart rate. So when your heart rate goes up, what's really happening? It's trying to pump more blood. How's it doing that? By squeezing more. How's it doing that? By contracting more. How's it doing that? Okay, your electrical stimulator, your sinus node in your heart's firing more rapidly. And that's causing what? Your more muscle contraction. And muscles are made of what? Proteins. So when we're talking about your body compensating for the volume loss that caused your blood pressure to drop, that caused your cardiac output to decrease, that caused your heart to start working harder to compensate for that, your heart's trying to work harder to perfuse your organs and itself in a state of acidosis. So what do you think that means for your heart's ability to pump harder? It's not going to work very well. It's not going to work very well because your heart's made of proteins, and we already established that your body needs a certain parameter of pH in order to work very well. So that acidosis is actually negatively impacting your heart's ability to pump, which means it's negatively impacting your heart's ability to compensate, which means your perfusion is going to do what? It's going to go down or up? It's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. But what else are proteins on here? Your coagulation factors? So what is that going to mean? What's going to happen to this when you're acidotic? Going to get worse or better? It's going to get worse. So you've already bled a bunch of coagulation factors out onto the ground, and now you're acidotic, and the coagulation factors that are left are going to work less good. Seems bad. Yeah, seems bad. But some other things are affected here too. Let's go back to the heat. You lose heat onto the ground and you get cold, and we said you get hypothermic, but something happens in between. What is it that happens in between being cold and hypothermic? Shivering. Who said that? You were right, shivering. What is shivering? It's your body's attempt, oh, we don't need to shout. It's your body's attempt to generate heat by doing what? Shaking. What's the shaking really? It's muscle contraction. It's rapid muscle contraction for the purpose of burning energy to make heat as a byproduct so that you get warm. But what does shivering require? Energy and your proteins to function effectively. So now we start to see why this decreased perfusion that we talked about a little bit ago was so problematic. Because if you have this decreased perfusion, I don't want gray, and decreased aerobic metabolism, you're not generating very much ATP. If you're not generating very much ATP, that's going to cause a problem for your muscles that need ATP, like this guy and these guys, because they need energy to function. But not only are they being affected by the lack of energy because you can't generate enough for your body to function at its optimum level, you're also now acidotic. And if you're acidotic, that's going to negatively impact your heart's ability to beat. We already established that. It's also going to impact your body's ability to shiver. So eventually what happens is what? Before you die, you do die. You stop shivering. And this is the process of hypothermia. We know at different degrees of temperature, and it's a little bit more complicated than that because there's impacts on your brain and your brainstem and all that stuff. But in general, you get so cold that you don't even shiver. And part of that is that you're also becoming acidotic and just cold, and your proteins just don't work when you're cold, and so you then become hypothermic. But we said that homeostasis isn't just acidosis, it's hypothermia also, or temperature also. So now that you're hypothermic, what's happening to all of your proteins? They're getting what? Worse, or their function is getting worse. So you're hypothermic now, and that's impacting your heart's ability to beat. You're hypothermic, you're also probably already not shivering, but if you could shiver, your muscles wouldn't work very well, right? So you're acidotic, your heart's not working very well, and you're hypothermic, which means your heart's working even less good, which does what to your perfusion? It gets even worse. And if your perfusion's getting even worse, you're getting less oxygen to your cells, which means you're getting less aerobic metabolism, which means you're getting more anaerobic metabolism and more acidosis. So this process is feeding back into itself, and this acidosis is just going to keep getting worse. And your heart function's going to keep getting worse. That's not what I wanted. Your heart function keeps getting worse. Your ability to regulate your temperature keeps getting worse. This is a struggle. And your ability to clot keeps getting worse because your clotting factors are proteins, and proteins need specific pH and specific temperature to work. So you've already bled your clotting factors out onto the ground, but now you're cold and acidotic, so they're working even less good, which means what about your bleeding? It gets worse. And you continue to bleed, but you can't make clots, so eventually you bleed so much that you die. But there's more to this. Because we said earlier that we, a couple of years ago, added hypocalcemia to our lethal triad and made it the deadly diamond, risky rhombus, perilous parallelogram. And I told you that that wasn't new. We've always known that low calcium was bad in the setting of trauma. We just didn't realize how bad it was. And the way that we decided, oh my gosh, this is terrible, is because when we looked at all of the data for all of our casualties in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, what we realized is that when people got to me in my medical facility, it's called a Rule 2, that they were hypocalcemic even when they shouldn't be. Because none of you are hypocalcemic. You all live in America, right? You all eat food from the grocery stores, right? You're not hypocalcemic. We put calcium in everything. So unless you have some disorder, some disease that's causing your body to not regulate its calcium, you are not hypocalcemic, and you should not be, even if you are injured. What we found was that wasn't true. People were hypocalcemic when they shouldn't be. And we know that hypocalcemia is bad because why? Where is calcium important on this board? We already said it impacts the clotting cascade. We already said it impacts both your platelets and your clotting factors. It's required to turn many of those on, not all of them, I think 3 of them, 2, 7, 9, and 10, maybe, I don't remember. Doesn't matter. You'll memorize it when you memorize the clotting cascade, and then you'll forget it like me. So we know calcium's important because it impacts the clotting cascade, but where else is calcium important on this board? Electrolytes, yes, but why? Why do we care about that? It's not your bones. It's something about your heart and trying to beat. Oh my gosh. It is part of that. So your muscle's ability to contract relies on action potentials and relies on the interaction between actin and myosin. You guys remember that? What helps actin and myosin interact? Calcium. I know, I didn't remember that either. It's fine. All you need to know is that your muscles require calcium to work. And what's made a muscle on here? Your heart, your skeletal muscles that help you shiver. One thing we don't have on here is your diaphragm is made of muscle. And none of these things are going to contract very well if you're hypocalcemic, in addition to the fact that you're not going to clot very well if you're hypocalcemic. So you bleed blood, you lose oxygen, your perfusion goes down, you go into anaerobic metabolism, you get acidotic, your clotting gets worse, your heart's ability to compensate gets worse, your ability to shiver and compensate for your hypothermia gets worse. And this all feeds back into itself to make everything worse and worse and worse until you get to the point of no return and you die, or the person who's injured dies. And it's even more complex than this because part of the reason you're hypocalcemic is something called trauma-induced coagulopathy, which is just the pathophysiology of trauma itself. Calcium gets driven into the cells where your body can't see it and use it. There's a lot of bad things that are going on. And eventually this spirals out of control, and it doesn't actually matter how good we all are as doctors, because at some point this will become completely insurmountable and completely irreversible. No matter how much blood we have, no matter how many medicines we have, dialysis, ECMO, all these fancy things won't matter because the damage will have been done. So what do? There's one key thing to fixing this problem. and that is stop the bleeding. Stop the bleeding. Because if this is a process that's feeding back into itself, that's just causing more coagulopathy and more bleeding, then even if I did have all the blood in the world to replenish you continuing to bleed, and we've done that before, 360 units of blood into one service member, he lived, it was something like 360, might have been 364. Even if we have all of that blood, if you keep bleeding it out, we're never going to solve the problem. We're never going to get ahead of that decreased perfusion because it's all just coming out. So we're just temporizing it and we're not fixing the problem. And the real problem is the bleeding itself, because the bleeding itself is what causes all of these downstream effects. So we have to stop the bleeding. How do we do that? Direct pressure. I love that. Direct pressure. The first thing you do is you apply direct pressure. And then what? You woosah for a second and you're like, oh God. Oh God. And then what do? Like all things in medicine, it depends. It depends. Because if it's your extremity, what could you do? Apply a tourniquet. But you can't always apply a tourniquet. So if you're bleeding inside your belly, if you're bleeding inside your chest, if you're bleeding from your neck, those are all places that we can't place a tourniquet. And those are places that you can bleed out from. But one of the single most important things that we have done in the history of the world to decrease death from traumatic injuries is introduce the tourniquet and then start trusting that the tourniquet is effective and putting it on people. There was a time when we were worried about putting tourniquets on people because we were going to decrease perfusion to that limb. I put a tourniquet on your thigh, your leg's not going to get perfused, right? When else is your leg not getting perfused? If you're dead. So we were kind of inappropriately afraid about putting tourniquets on people because they're like, oh, well, they'll lose their leg. And I'm like, well, I mean, yeah, maybe, but like also they won't be dead. So we started putting tourniquets on people aggressively, and what we saw, at least in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that our mortality rate on the battlefield plummeted. The one thing that we still have trouble with is treating people's bleeding when we can't put a tourniquet on. And we've tried to make a lot of different fancy devices, abdominal tourniquets, junctional tourniquets. They all don't work very well. There are some other things we can do, and if we have time after this, we will go through that. But right now, what we're gonna do is play with some tourniquets. So, it's a little bit weird because you guys are all at tables, so I'll probably have you guys just split up into groups and we're gonna pass out some tourniquets and we're gonna teach you guys how to put them on. So there's a bunch of different types of tourniquets. We'll use these ones in the box first. These are called CAT tourniquets or combat action tourniquets. It's one of our favorite ones to use on the battlefield because we've put a lot of energy and effort into designing this to be effective and to be easy to use and to not break down very well. So what we like about this tourniquet is that you can put it on yourself, you can put it on someone else. It will absolutely decrease your or stop your bleeding if put on effectively, but you have to be able to put it on effectively. Because if you put a tourniquet on ineffectively, not only will you not stop the bleeding, you can actually make things worse. So we're going to teach you how to put on a tourniquet, but the first thing you have to know about a tourniquet is that tourniquets only work if they can be put tight enough to completely stop arterial bleeding. So when you probably have all given blood at some time, or all had an IV placed at some time, all had labs drawn at some time, and what do? They put that little rubber tourniquet on your arm. That rubber tourniquet's actually only stopping your venous blood flow. So the venous blood flow can't get out of your arm, but the arterial blood flow can get in. Your veins puff up, we poke a hole in it, we suck out your blood, we send it to the lab, or we put an IV in you, etc. We need this to be an arterial tourniquet. So it has to have enough pressure to stop both venous and arterial blood flow. A couple of the key things are that it has to be pretty wide, somewhere around 1.5 inches, 2 inches, but it can't be very narrow because if it's narrow, it's not going to effectively stop bleeding. So something very wide. And then it has to be very, very, very tight. And what I tell people when I'm teaching tourniquets is if the tourniquet doesn't hurt worse than the original injury, it's probably not tight enough.
Can I? I'm going to speak kind of loudly because I'm not mic'd up fully like her, but has anyone ever heard of something called the chief cuddler? Anybody? Chief cuddler? No, I wouldn't expect you guys to. But the chief cuddler is something that was invented by an Army service member specifically for all of those things that she talked about in the Deadly Diamond. So what she was saying about people bleeding out, they're getting cold, losing more blood, everything's just not working. So the thought process behind the chief cuddler was to get the patient warm. So this happened in a deployed, more so austere setting, and they didn't have these special warming blankets. They hadn't come in yet. So what this Army service member did is they took some cardboard boxes, some tape, some PVC pipe, and a hair dryer, and they essentially created this coffin-like structure that the hair dryer blew into, and they were able to increase the patient's body temperature by around 6 degrees in over a 3-hour period. So the reason why I wanted to segue into that, because that device, the chief cuddler is what they named it, is on display at the Army Medical Museum. And I wanted to let you guys know before we wrap this up, you guys are gonna do a lot of hands-on stuff here. You got a nice presentation, but on November 18th at the Army Medical Museum, we are opening it to the public where you guys can come see all of the important impacts that the Army medicine has made, and also do more hands-on activities like this. We're gonna have a variety of healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, vet, you name it, they're gonna be out there. So I was gonna put a QR code out here, but I know I don't have a service down here, but we have an Eventbrite page, Meet Army Medicine. So if you go on Eventbrite, it's totally free. Just RSVP so we know you're coming. But please come out if you want to know more about this and get some more hands-on stuff. It's totally free.
All right, love that. The Army's done a lot, probably the most for management of trauma, because we do a lot of it. Okay, we're gonna practice. So who needs more tourniquets? Everybody got like maybe one every pair? Okay, can you pass out some tourniquets? Okay, we're gonna practice. So buddy up, listen, y'all. This Velcro, it will ruin your pretty clothes if you have something like synthetic on. So listen, I'm not buying you a new shirt, okay? Not buying you a new shirt. Okay.
Probably have to team up because
Okay.
we don't have enough.
Okay, well you can pass, I have 3 down there. And then we're gonna learn how to do an improvised tourniquet. So a couple things. First of all, you have to have a tourniquet available to you. Now in the Army, we all have a tourniquet somewhere on our body. And it depends on what unit you're in, what the standard is. Sometimes it's in your shirt pocket, sometimes it's in your leg pocket. Sometimes it's on your, what we call your kit or your IOTV, your little body armor. I carry them on my body armor, which I was obviously not gonna wear today, but also my gun belt. So I have a tourniquet here, and I have a tourniquet here in my individual aid kit, first aid kit, which is called an IFAC. This is where all of the stuff is in that you need to save my life, at least from the very, very start of saving my life at the point of injury. So first you have to have access to a tourniquet. Now I carry it on my gun belt. You're not gonna be wearing a gun belt on all the time, so where are you gonna carry your tourniquet? In your car. That's the easiest place to carry a tourniquet, and you will be surprised how many times people actually wind up using tourniquets in their car. I see it all the time, even I'm from Fort Cavazos, formerly known as Fort Hood. I have people come in all the time, they're like, something happened, somebody got an injury, I got my tourniquet out of my car. I've had people come into the emergency department as patients after rollover motor vehicle collisions with amputated extremities that their lives were saved because someone either put on a real tourniquet or an improvised tourniquet. So you have to have access to it. If you don't have a tourniquet, you don't have access to it. So I encourage you, if you do the Stop the Bleed, I think they maybe give out tourniquets, I'm not sure, but you can get them on Amazon. Don't get this blue one, it's for training. I mean, it might work, but maybe not. So get one that's not for training. All right, so we can either put this on ourselves or put it on someone else. There's a couple tricks to that. Number one is you have to know how to do it. It comes packaged up in this little package, and you have to open it up. Now, different people do this differently, and I don't take it out of the package. I just leave it in the package, and the first thing I do is I take it all apart like this. I take it all apart like this because depending on where I'm putting it, I put it on differently. So if I'm putting it on this gentleman here, it can already be looped and I can just put it on his arm. But if he's laying on the ground and it's already looped like this and I need to put this on his leg, I have to lift up his very heavy leg, and let me tell you about how heavy some dudes' legs are, and slip this around. So if I'm putting it on a leg, I want it to be taken apart so that I can thread it underneath of the leg and then put it on. But you guys said the first step is not putting on the tourniquet. What was the first step? Direct pressure. So how do I do that? Any way you can. Put your fingers in the wound, try to find that blood vessel that's bleeding, put your hand or your fist or your knee on the spot proximal to where the bleeding is. And the best representation of that is that if his leg is bleeding, because he got in a bar fight on 6th Street, should have gone to Rainy Street. I haven't been to any of those in a long time. What I'm gonna do, I'm not gonna do it on him because I'll probably hurt him, is I'm gonna just drop my knee in his groin. Because what's in your groin? Your femoral artery. So if I can put pressure on his femoral artery, I will hopefully at least reduce the bleeding distal to that. So I drop my knee on his groin, and the reason I do that is because I need both hands to put on a tourniquet. Make sense? So if I put my fist in here, I'm gonna have to figure out, if I put my fist on, let's say, his injury, or put my fingers inside of his injury, at some point I'm gonna have to take my hands off. Now you might have to do that, and that's okay. You gotta do what you gotta do to help this person not die. But if I put my knee there, I don't have to let my hands go. Now, your other option is that you may have something, in the Army we have something called combat gauze that will stick in a wound. So I could do that also. But if someone is bleeding to that extent, really ideally you want the tourniquet. So how am I gonna do that? I'm separated out like this. I'm gonna stop his bleeding as much as I can, get my tourniquet out or get his tourniquet out. I'm gonna thread it underneath his leg, and I put this as high up on his extremity as possible. We call this high and tight. We want these high and tight because they're more likely to stop the bleeding and less likely to fall off. So we used to try to put them lower down, closer to the injury. Don't think about it. Turn your brain off and make it go high and tight. Someone else can deal with converting your tourniquet later on. That's not your concern. So I get this as high in his groin as possible. I thread it through, and then I'm gonna cinch it down. Now, part of this effect of this tourniquet is cinching this down as much as possible. So you have to pull it as tight as possible. So I want you guys to take a look at what I did here and critique what I'm doing and tell me if I'm gonna be able to make this tourniquet super, super tight just by pulling this Velcro. No? Who said no? Why would you change it? Or how would you change it? It looks awkward. It looks weird. I agree. So on the leg, I actually want to be pulling towards me, not away from me. So in order to get this really tight, I want to be able to pull down and force all my body weight on this, instead of pushing away from me into his crotch, which is going to make it difficult. Now, if I were on the other side of him for some reason, I might pull the other way, but I'm still pulling towards me because I want to get all my body weight on him. And for those of us who would rather sit on the couch than go to the gym, this is helpful. So I'm going to pull this as tight as possible, and then I'm going to Velcro it down. And then you have this little plastic thing called a windlass. This windlass is really what's going to get things extra, extra tight. And what you're going to do is you're going to rotate this in whatever direction you care to, as many times as humanly possible. And if he's screaming, you're doing a good job, okay? It should be painful. You're cutting off the blood supply to this extremity. So you tighten this as many times as you possibly can. And then there's a little hook here, a plastic hook, and you just loop the end into the hook. Now, if it's too tight for you, either mechanically or logistically to get it in, you might have to loosen it up. So it has to be tight enough, as tight as possible, but you still got to get it into this little hook so that it stays in place. And then you got to get this person to somebody else, okay? So we're going to practice this in a second. You do the same thing on the arm, but I want to show you something that's a little bit different if you have to put the tourniquet on yourself. So I'm left-handed, so I'm going to put this on my right arm, but imagine how difficult it would be to put a tourniquet on yourself using your non-dominant hand. Yikes. So if I'm putting it on my arm myself, ideally I want it looped still so that I can just put it up over my arm, right? Because if I am missing an arm, God forbid, or having difficulty maneuvering this, it's going to be difficult to thread it after it's around my arm. So I want it looped. And this time, I want the strap being pulled towards the center. Always pulled towards the center, because if I do it the other way, how tight am I going to be able to get this? It's just going to keep rotating, and it's going to be very difficult. So I like to pull it towards me so that I can get it nice and tight. So you pull it towards yourself, you get it as tight as you possibly can, you Velcro it down, and then you make this as tight as you can. And if it's so painful that you can't turn it anymore, you keep going. Keep going. Okay, let's practice. There's a couple things to think about when you're improvising a tourniquet. Number one is that it has to be wide. You can't grab a skinny little rope. I mean, if it's all you've got, you do what you got to do. But ideally, it's something that's wide. Remember, we said the wider it is, the better it's going to be at compressing that artery. So it can be something like a shirt. We're going to do it with this shirt that I found in the bottom of my closet. Or what we like to use in the Army is something called a cravat, which is a fancy term for a piece of cloth cut in a triangle shape. So this cravat we use for lots of different things. We use it for securing bandages. We use it as a makeshift tourniquet. We use it as a makeshift sling. It comes with safety pins, very lovely, and a rubber band. But this cravat is basically just, they're sometimes green and they're sometimes white. It's basically just a linen cloth that's cut into the shape of a triangle. So what other things might you have laying around the house that kind of look like this? A bandana, a scarf, yeah, something like that. Now, a lot of people say, can I use a belt? And the answer is, you could use a belt, but the problem with the belt is you can't actually get it very tight. Now, I have had people come into my emergency department with belts on their amputated extremities, and they lived. So you got to do what you got to do. But ideally, it's something that's a couple inches wide, like a cravat or a shirt or a scarf or a ripped piece of t-shirt that was in the floorboard of your car that you haven't cleaned out. This is why you should never clean your car, y'all, because you never know. And the snacks if you get stranded. But then you have to be able to create a windlass. So what I'm going to do is wrap this around, and it doesn't have to be pretty, and I'm going to tie it as tight as I can. Now, you're not going to be able to get it super tight, right? Because we can only make it as tight as we can. And then you need something to make a windlass. Now, I have a lot of random medical equipment in my car, so like this was literally in the floorboard. These are 9-inch pins. We use these for chest tubes. But scissors work really well. Things like pens and pencils don't really work because they're going to break. It has to be something that's not going to break, so preferably something that's metal. A stick would work too, if that's all you've got. But I've got to be able to make a windlass. He's going to bleed out and die, sorry. Good Samaritan laws. And so I'm going to tie this on here, and then what am I going to do? I'm going to spin it. I'm going to spin it as much as I can, but then what do I got to do? You got to secure it. So you're going to have to eventually secure it against the way it wants to unravel. And how do you do that? However you can. It doesn't have to look good, it just has to work. And so that's what you can do if you need to do something improvised. It's beautiful. Not really. Obviously, I don't. He's delicate. I don't want to hurt him.
Sustained all the wounds today.
Yeah,
He's clumsy.
you know.
Too much time on 6th Street. Do people even still go to 6th Street? I went to school at Baylor, as you guys know, and so it was like the fun thing to do to. That was back before Baylor had like Joanna and what's his name, Chip and Joanna Gaines, and it was not. There was nothing to do. So you could do this with a shirt. This would work too. So I could put this shirt around him that I found in the floorboard of my car. Not really. It was in the bottom of my closet. And I could do the same thing. Now this is a little bit stretchy, so it's not ideal. But if it's all you've got, it's all you've got. Since I have a whole bunch of stuff here, I would probably do this a couple times if I needed to, but then what are we gonna do? We're gonna make a win list with whatever we've got. He would be on the floor, so this would be much easier. It's not me, it's him. And then if something's stretchy, I'm gonna have to turn it a lot more, but I'm gonna turn this as much as I can, and then what am I gonna do? Secure it. So if you guys wanna play with the shirt or the cravat, you can too. All right, what questions do you guys have for me? You guys did great today. I'm super impressed with your knowledge of the pathophysiology of bleeding. You all get A's in physics and human physiology.